Welcome to the next installment of Bhagavatam's Puranic Cosmology, and today we will get foundations of the Zodiac. So it's quite interesting to the astrological audience. So let's begin with a quick recap of the key points and then a quick review of the stuff up to this point, and then we'll pause and go into detail on the new content, which today is the 13th and the 14th text, and then we'll take a look at the new context visually too, the new content visually. Alrighty, so the first significant thing to remember is that the explicitly stated in the beginning of the chapter, the purpose of a discussion of astronomy and geography in the Bhagavatam is to evoke emotion. So it's not a clinical study of astronomy or geology or whatever, physics, anything, cosmology. It's one intended to create an emotional response. Hence, it uses vikalpa, metaphor, ideas, imagination to explain things in ways that you can relate to. So, for example, we'll explain things as flowers and mountains and fruits and rivers, when actually there's not gigantic mangoes flying around in outer space like satellites orbiting the Earth. So that's an important thing to realize, that they're describing the universe, the cosmos, the Earth, poetically, using metaphor, but not inaccurately. Accurately, but using metaphor. The second very important point that is explicitly stated at the beginning of this section is that the Bhagavatam is not claiming to give an exclusive definition of the cosmos. The cosmos are infinite by nature, and there's infinite relative viewpoints that you can have on it. Therefore, there's an infinite number of valid ways of describing its structure. So it's going to be describing it from the observational viewpoint, which means it will be apparently geocentric, even though the structure or the mechanics that are involved in the cosmos are heliocentric, and their extent and borders are defined explicitly in the Bhagavatam by the extent of the sun's gravity. Okay, so those are the key introductory points that are mentioned in like the first four texts. Then when Shuka begins describing the cosmos, he zooms in on Earth from a broad view of something called the Bhu Mandala. So he zooms in on Bhu after starting from a zoomed out position of Bhu Mandala. So a key thing to realize is that Bhu itself is not described as a mandala, but the Bhu Mandala is a mandala centered upon Bhu. And furthermore, mandala doesn't mean a disc or a plate. Mandala means a collection around the center. So it can refer to social groups or teams that work with a leader. They're called a mandala. Or anything that has a center, and things which have a single center, they become a circle. So mandala in geometry refers to circular shapes. Circular shapes can be two-dimensional or three-dimensional, and mandala refers to both. Discs as well as spheres and balls. So what he says about Bhu Mandala is that there's a sphere at the middle of it that is like a lotus bud. And around this sphere, there's a plane, a circular plane of circular orbits, kosha, abhyantara kosha, concentric circles of orbits that are rotating around this central ball. So it's far from a big flat Earth disk or something. It's a geocentric solar system. Why is it geocentric? Again, just to reiterate, because that's one way of looking at it. And it literally is the way that we look at it when we stand on Earth, is geocentric. So from here, I have visual aids. Where are they? Here they are. So from here, he starts to describe, he zooms into the blue part, to the globe that's in the middle of this collection of orbits. And he describes that at the center of that, there's something called Ilavrita. And at the center of that, there's something called Meru, which is the ultimate center of everything. So picture it like that. Meru expands and permeates. And these words are exactly stated, but this is just a review. If you want to get these things in full detail because you're not sure about them, go back to watch the recorded sessions that we did in previous weeks. Meru, from a center, it expands. Actually, it's going to have two kinds of echoes of its center. The first echo is going to define the surface of the globe, and the second echo is going to define the ecliptic plane. So there it is. He says it's an entirely metallic Sarvata Suvarna core of everything at in the center of Earth. But by its expansion out, creating a dome, Vitapa, it creates a big gigantic circular plane. Then he says, from Meru north, going north from Meru, which means going up from Meru, there's more Girya. Girya means circular things that encompass other things, but also metaphorically means mountains. And also he's describing Meru as a mountain as well, and because mountains are big geographical landmarks. But what Girya actually means is an encompassing circle. So going north from Meru, there's these three circles that get smaller in their circumference as they go further north. So he describes this, which means he's just described a dome. So instead of a flat Earth theory, you have a dome Earth theory. No, because then he says the same thing happens to the south. So instead of a dome Earth theory, guess what you got? You got a sphere, which makes sense. Then he says you also have an east and west. I think I'll show that next. Yeah, you also have an east and west sense to it because this whole sphere is turning. I forget the exact Sanskrit word that he says, but the easternness is known by its rising into view. And the westernness is known by its setting away from view. And then he goes through and he names all these things, which are quite super, super interesting. But I want to get to the new material in this session. So if you haven't yet explored how interesting all these things are, go back to watch last week's episode. Let's just try to scoot through these now. He names the three primary latitudes north, the three primary latitudes south, the regions located in between each one of those latitudes, north and south. He names the eastern longitudes and the western longitudes, and then the eastern area and the western area. All these names really just confirm that what he's talking about is latitude-longitude system on the sphere. Then, to talk about the next echo or evolution or pulse of Meru. The first pulse from the core of Meru is creating a spherical surface on which we live. The second permutation of Meru is a bigger circle. Because the other thing that Meru does, by being a point in space, it establishes relative direction. Without a point, you have no direction in space. But with a point like Meru, which can act as a center point, then you can have a relative sense of up, down, forward, and back. which is north, south, east, west. So when you project the north, south, east, and west out from the earth, which is an important thing about the latitude-longitude system in Bhagavatam, is that it's projectable. Its elevation, you can elevate it out into celestial objects. And so you can project distant things to surface things. He says if you project these 4 points out, then you get these 4 pillars. This is going to be important. We're going to talk about this in more detail today as well, because today we're talking about the foundations of the Zodiac, which the Zodiac is the way that you conceive of the ecliptic. So here Mero's creating the ecliptic by creating these 4 points, which he names, and he says there's trees growing on each point that are the flags for the point, for the pillar. The flags of the pillar are these trees that have particular kinds of fruits. The flag of the northern pillar is the summer fruit mango, which falls. Chiuta means it falls. The flag on the southern pillar is jambu, which is a pear, a different kind of pear, but it has the pear shape. It's jambu means you ate too much, and you got fat on the bottom. Hence, this fruit is called jambu. Fat on the bottom. It's the southern waypoint. You probably know that it's the southern solstice. On the east is kadamba. It's this big globular flower that's shooting off rays. It's the sun rising above Mero's center line. And in the west is Nyagroda, the downgrower, the banyan, the sun setting below Mero's center point. So as I mentioned, you probably already know, even if you didn't watch last week, that this is obviously the northern southern solstice, the eastern western equinox, projected out onto the ecliptic, which these trees, they spread branches to materialize this second perimeter of Mero, extended perimeter. That is the ecliptic. Ecliptic is the path on which the sun moves. Now, from this, we come to today's material. The foundations of the Zodiac in Bhagavatam's Vedic cosmology. So now let's switch gears and go into a slower gear and look at some new material. I'll just make sure that there's not any relevant questions. Good or not good. Let's see. Let's switch gears and now start to look at some text. Okay, so we're in the 13th and the 14th text right now. 13th text has 2 sentences in it. Hradash chatvara payo madvikshu rasa mrishta jala. So he says, in relation to these 4 pillars that we know as the eastern, western, northern, southern waypoints in the ecliptic, in other words, the solstices and equinoxes, the tropos, there's also 4 hrada, which means lakes. Now, when you're doing poetry, everything is about the double meaning or the inner meaning of a word. So it's really always important to not just take the surface meaning of the word. Remember, as explicitly stated in the beginning of this chapter, this is poetic description of the cosmos because it's meant to evoke emotion. So hrada is based on the word hri, which means to hold something in place. And so the reason why hrada means a lake is because it's a place where flowing water stops flowing. So like an offshoot of a river becomes a hrada, or where the rivers come in to collect in a reservoir, that's called a hrada. So it means some place that's been fixed or held. Then he says payo, which paya madhu ikshurasa mrishtajala. The reflex is to say, well, there's 4 lakes and there's 5 words here. Payo madhu ikshurasa mrishta Jala. Well, Mrishta isn't really a word. It isn't really like a noun. Right? So you got 4 nouns, and he said there's 4 lakes. So the impulse is to say that these 4 words are describing these 4 lakes 1 to 1, respectively. But the grammar doesn't really allow that, as far as I can see. Because the way the grammar is composed, you have payaha and jalaha. Right? I think jala, I had sandhi on the end of it. Yeah, I have unnecessary sandhi. 1 second. Paya is grammatically nouned in the first, in the nominative, and then jala is also nominative, and so it's clear it's grammar as a noun. But then you have madhu, ikshurasa, and mrishta. These 3 other words, they're compounded onto jala, so they're not being treated as separate terms. So I've seen most translators and most people thinking about this tend to think Paya is describing one of the lakes, Madhu is describing another lake, Ikshurasha is describing another, and Mrishtajala is describing the 4th. However, the grammar makes one feel uncomfortable using that. So rather, it simply means Madhu Ikshurasha means honey and sugar. Mrishta means, in one sense, mrishta means pure, but mrishta means when something has been cleaned or polished. So when you take some compound and mix it in, so primary meaning for the word mrishta is mixed, like mishra, mrishta, mixed. So I'm not making these things up. You could think that I'm just making them up, but that would mean that you don't have access to dictionaries, because you can find these things in the dictionaries, or you might need to go to Datus and check Datus from some of the things I'm saying. But what he's saying here is the madhu and the ikshurasa. Ikshurasa means the juice of a sugar cane, so like molasses or sugar juice. And madhu is honey usually. So honey and molasses mixed in jala, water. Paya, that's what it tastes like. That's what it drinks like. So he's just describing the quality of the water in these lakes. And that's going to be evidenced in the next sentence that he says. He just uses the word yat, which means he's referring to a single thing, that water. So, as I say, we slow down here so we make sure we get everything right. Hrada Chatvara Payo Madvikshurasha Mrishta Jala means there are 4 lakes whose waters taste like they are mixed with sugar and honey. He doesn't explicitly say where they are, but it's right after he's talking about the ecliptic formed by these 4 points. So these lakes, 4 of these lakes with 4 of these points, there must be a lake per a point. Then in the next part of his statement, he says, Yad upasparshina upadeva gana yogaishvaryani swabhavikani bharatarshaba dharayanti. So this is a very interesting statement, not cosmologically. It's not really a cosmological statement, but it's very interesting as far as I can tell. Yat upasparshina means, so there's the word yat, by touching that water. So it's not like there's 4 different kinds of water, but it's one kind of water, and by touching it. Now, upasparshina, sparsha means to touch, but upasparsha specifically is a word used to describe sacred bath or sipping something respectfully, sipping a sacred water respectfully. So it's by ceremonially bathing in and sipping that water. And these 4 cosmic lakes that are associated with these 4 tropos, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, by bathing in it, by ceremony related to it. That's what upasparshana means. By ceremony related to these four tropos and the surrounding areas, that is how the sub-gods, updevagana, get their natural power. Yoga Aishwarya Swabhavika Dharana. That's how and why they possess mystic power. Bharatarshaba, O Parikshit, O Emperor. So the sub-gods possess mystic powers simply because they ceremonially bathe in and sip that water. So what he's talking about here is most of the Vedic rituals that are in places like Shatapatha Brahmana. The really core Nitya karma, the Nitya rituals, the rituals that happen on a schedule every year. The really fundamental Vedic ceremonies that observe the Sankrantis and that observe the Vishuvats and the Ayanas, the solstices, the equinoxes, the ingresses. Those are the key Vedic ceremonies. And what he's saying here is if you observe those ceremonies, you get success and power, siddhi. So here's what he's saying is that this ecliptic is very powerful. This water that's in this ecliptic, if it's worshipped, if you bathe in this lake, then you get good fortune. So this is also a foundational concept for astrology and the zodiac, that the ecliptic is not just an impartial space that the sun travels through. The space that the sun travels through determines how the year progresses. So paying attention to and worshiping and respecting the progress of the sun is highly, highly important for your prosperity here on earth. Upadevagana also can be a poetic way of saying, you guys, you human beings, you're the Upadevas. You're almost gods. Okay? Clear? So, of all those ceremonies, the most important one is Makar Sankranti, which people do not observe correctly because of taking a sidereal Makara, sidereal Capricorn. They blow the whole thing. And so prosperity is very diminished. Kumbh Mela, all those things were originally zodiacal celebrations. Any questions so far? So then he says, the next statement, 14. Devodhyanani cha bhavanti chatvari. Nandanam chaitratham vaibhrajakam sarvato bhadram iti. Deva Udyanani. There are also 4 parks. Udyanani, parks. And also the literal meaning for park is important. The literal meaning for lake is important, right? The literal by literal I mean the root meaning. The yoga pada, not the arudapada, but the root meaning of the word for lake is hri, holding in place. And the root for uddayana is utya, which means you can get up and go and come back. It's not important. You wander around in this place. So a park is a place where you just walk around, but you don't walk to a destination. It's not like you're walking to a store or you're walking to somebody's house. A park, you just go for a walk. That's why it's called a park. I mean, in English it makes no sense, I think. But in Sanskrit, that's the uddayana. Uddiyana. Means get up and move around. remember that, bear that in mind, because that will make all the sense out of this. So in between, associated with each cardinal point, the eastern, northern, western, and southern cardinal points, the two equinoxes and the solstices, there's one fixed point, sorry to let the cat out of the bag, and one wandering point. There's one lake and there's one garden, park. And he does name the four gardens. See, he uses the word iti. He's quite clear. These people, even when they're being poetic, they're clear about their poetry. So he says these things are named with these following names: Nandana, Chaitraratra, Vaibhrajakanam, and Sarvotpadram. So these names, of course, are always really important. Nandana is the most famous of the gardens because it's Indra's. And hence we know it's the eastern one. Nandana means the gladdener, the one that brings up the joy. Anand, Nand. Nandana and Anand are basically the same. The one that brings up the joy. Then Chaitrarata, Chitra. You know that nakshatra called Chitra, it's sparkly, right? Chaitra means sparkles, rays. Rata, the sparkling chariot. So here the sun is shining very bright. Chaitrarata. Chaitra, Chitta also is your contemplation. This is Chaitra, but you get from the same root. So Chaitrarata also means the thing that delights the thinking or delights the experience. Ratam is also like Manoratam or Rati. So a beautiful meaning of Chaitrarata is that it's fascinating. It delights your thoughts. But the more literal meaning of it is that it's sparkling very brightly. It's shining very brightly. That's the second lake. And then the third lake is called Vaibhrajaka. So here, Braj, Bra, Pa. Pa is the root. It means shining. Bra means to give off light. Vipra means not to shine much. You're losing your shine. Vipra. Vaibra, the rays that are declining. So this garden is sunset garden. Nandana garden is arousing. It's sunrise garden. Chaitrarata, it's bright garden. Vaibhraja garden, it's dimming. Vibraj, it's sunset garden. And then Sarvatabhadra, it's auspicious everywhere. But it can also mean that everyone is asleep. Everyone is peaceful. Everyone is calm. So it can also mean it's the midnight garden. Remember that the path of the sun over the course of a year exactly corresponds to the path of the sun over the course of a day, in the sense of passing 4 key waypoints. It's just that on the course of a day, the reference point is the horizon of the earth, but on the course of a year, the reference point is the equator of the earth, the projection of Meru. So the way that they're the same is, over the course of a day, the earth rises over the horizon, hits the top, hits a peak, comes back down to the horizon, hits a nadir, hits a bottom, and comes back up. Same thing happens over the course of the year relative to the equator. The sun rises at the beginning. That's called Nandana. Then the sun comes to a peak. That's Chitrarat. Then it comes down and sets. That's Vibraj. Then it comes down to the bottom. It's analogous to midnight, Sarvatabhadra. Then it comes up again. Okay. So that is the new material. There are 4 celestial gardens named Gladdener, Bright Shiner, Non-Shiner, and All Auspicious. So just to read it all in one pocket. After describing the 4 key points with the 4 flags of the 4 trees, the north, west, south, and east projected into space, and he says, in relation with those, there's 4 lakes whose waters taste like they are mixed with sugar and honey. In other words, the water is great. By ceremoniously bathing in and sipping that water, the sub-gods possess mystic powers simply because they ceremoniously bathe in and sip that water. And, well, let me get to this. And there are 4 celestial gardens named Gladdener, Bright Shiner, Non-Shiner, and All Auspicious. Now let's look at this visually. Visually. All right, I probably have to try to get out of the way a little bit. So, I might even shut. Yeah, if I get in the way. So this is what we have so far from before today's text. We have these 4 projected points out to the ecliptic, defining these pillars or these wayposts characterized by these trees that describe what happens to the sun. At these points, the northern solstice, the southern solstice, the eastern equinox, the western equinox. What we learned today is that there are 4 lakes and 4 parks to go along with these 4 points. So this is what we have on our plate right now. This is what Shuka has described for us so far. I'm sure to people who are familiar with astrology, this is starting to look very familiar. I mean, people who are truly familiar with astrology, it already looked familiar as soon as I put these 4 dots out there. But now, even people who are casually familiar with astrology probably are onto something. Because we just made 12 points. And this is not novel. This is found explicitly that stated that you should do this in Surya Siddhanta and elsewhere. So all of a sudden now, things are looking really familiar to how we've been thinking about local space for centuries and millennia. So this doesn't sound like the Bhagavatam is talking about something from out of left field. Now, from here, what we do is if we go back and think about these words for pillar, lake, and garden or park, right? We talked about the Udyana. It means the place where you wander. You don't have a particular destination, but you do move around. So that would be in astrology called the quality. What do they call this? The quadruplicity? I always forget whether it's a quadruplicity or a triplicity. I call it a mode. It's called the mode of dualness. Dvandam. Dualness means you go back and forth. You wander around. And then hrada is based on the word hri, which means to hold something and fix it, hold it in place. That's the sthira quality, the fixed quality in the zodiac. So there's a dual quality and a fixed quality. And then avastamba, which means pillar, actually means not standing still, getting started. Stamba means to stand still. Avastamba means to leave the condition of standing still. It means to begin. And this is why it's called a pillar in the first place. Because it's the pillar is the foundation that holds up the building. So what is a cardinal sign? It's the beginning of a zone defined by a cardinal point. It's the beginning of a whole quadrant. So the avastamba is actually the cardinal spot, the beginning spot. And then the hrada, or the lake zone, is the fixed spot. And then the udyana, the park, the garden spot, is actually the roaming place, the dual location. So we just confirmed that we're actually looking at a poetic description of the foundations of the zodiac. Here it is, 12-fold division of the ecliptic with these 3 intrinsic qualities to it. Because these qualities are intrinsic. It's not somebody made it up on a trip of LSD. It's intrinsic to the nature. When the sun passes a key point, it has become cardinal because it's past a new point. So it's starting something new. And that's what cardinal means, to start something new. Avastamba, get started. When it's past that point, but still continuing in the same direction, then it's rada. It's fixed. It's being constant. When it's at the end of that section, it's starting to see a new section on the horizon, but it's still involved in completing the previous section, and that's why it's like a park where it wanders around, it goes back and forth. It's dual. So he's described these three intrinsic zones within each quadrant created by these four pillars on the ecliptic path of round Bu. So you see, you basically have this, don't you? And I think that's it. That was fast. It takes a long time to translate the stuff and figure it out, but it doesn't take as long to explain it. So any questions? Is there one more thing? I'm afraid to click it, because if I click it and there's nothing left, it will go away. I think this is it. Any questions about this? The names. The names. Here, look at where they're placed. We have to put Nandana as the easternmost garden. The easternmost garden would be the one that defines the beginning of Pisces, what we know as Pisces. So that would be Nandana. It's the gladdening dual sign because it's approaching the rising equinox. Now, whether you are in the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere makes absolutely no difference, because we're talking about the sun's relationship to the equator. It's not located on Earth anywhere. It's an issue between the sun and the equator. The sun is going up north of the equator here at the eastern equinox, so we call it the rising equinox, the rising waypoint, the kadamba, where the rays come out. And before that, it's called Nandana. People become glad that the sunrise is coming. They get inspired, they get aroused, they wake up. Then the second park, which was named, was Chaitrarata, brilliant rays. That would be where the Gemini division is, what we call the Gemini division. It's that dual sign. It's the northern dual sign. Because here the sun is shining bright. This is the noon park. The sun is Chaitrarata, it's brilliant. And then the third name for the park was Vaiprajika, the non-shiner. This is the Virgo area, which borders on Libra. So it borders on the western equinox. So this is where the sun is setting. That's why this is the sunset park. The fourth named park was Sarvatabhadra, all auspicious or everybody's asleep. To explain what the all auspicious part is this is the auspiciousness of Makar Sankranti specifically. It's because although the sun is in the south, it begins to move north. So therefore it's benefiting both the northerners and the southerners. I guess there's no reason why you couldn't say the same thing of the north. Although the sun is in the north, it begins to move south, so therefore it's benefiting both the northerners and the southerners. But the difference between the two is that from the north, it's a decline, which is not Bhadra. But it's not auspicious to decline. It doesn't feel auspicious. So that's one sense of the word, why they would name the garden that's at the winter equinox, the so-called winter equinox, the southern equinox. Why would they name that Sarvatabhadra? One is because although it's all the way down there, it's coming back up. So it's good for the Asuras, but it's also good for the Devas. But the Bhadra also means to lie down, like in the Bhadrapadas, Uttara Bhadrapada, Purva Bhadrapada. Bhadra also means kind of to be at peace. Almost like we say in English, rest in peace. So to be at peace or to lie down. So the hidden meaning in this Sarvata Bhadra means everybody's asleep, because the sun here is at the midnight of the year in this park. All right, so that's all that I have for you this week. So far from being something radically impossible to believe in, or mythological, or whatever you want to term it, the fifth canon of the Bhagavatam is presenting very standard cosmology. We got a globe with a latitude-longitude system at the center of concentric orbits of things, projecting out a sense of an ecliptic plane around which the sun hits 4 key points, each of which has 2 key points within them, and how the sun is acting within that region, creating a 12-fold system. It's very, very conventional. Katie, I still do not understand how all this relates to the Southern Hemisphere. What did I talk about here that has anything to do with whether it's warm or not? There's nothing here is talking about weather. Also, Katie, let me just share you this one link so that you can check this out in more detail. Just give me a second and I'll get this link. Where are we? Please check this out. It has nothing to do with the weather. It's how the sun is related to the equator. South is south. It doesn't matter if you're south of the equator or not. South is south. South means lower than Meru. Lower than Meru. North means higher than Meru. East means the direction Meru is rotating into, and west means the direction that Meru is rotating. East means the direction that Meru is rotating from, and west is the direction it's rotating into. So it's all about Meru. It's not about you. The weather that you experience at your location is dependent on you and your location. For you, south is colder and north is hotter. For me, south is warmer and north is colder. But nothing about any of the stuff that we talk about, or nothing about the Zodiac, cares about that. Meteorologists care about that. Your choice of clothing cares about that. But the Zodiac doesn't care. Summer fruit, winter fruit is because he's talking to Parikshit, who's in the northern hemisphere, and he's trying to tell him in a poem that I'm talking about the northern solstice. I'm talking about the southern solstice. But even the summer fruit, the winter fruit is part of the analogy. But the shape of the mango itself, the mango is fat on top and it falls down. And the jambu is fat on the bottom. So mango's fat on top, jambu is fat on the bottom. So the northern solstice is mango. It's symbolized or identified. It's flagged by mango. Southern hemisphere is symbolized, identified, flagged by jambu, a pear. So, Vanna asks, can you please share what the water drinking ritual is? It's not a water drinking ritual. He's saying if you observe the Sankrantis, if you observe the sun's ingresses into these 12 zones, especially to these 4 points, and especially to the fundamental point, which is the southern solstice, then you'll be prosperous. You'll have natural power. You'll have natural health. And if you don't observe these, or you observe them incorrectly, you won't prosper. That's what he's saying. As for what he's talking about because he's talking about the poem of there being a lake, then he's saying that the way that you would observe this ceremony is by bathing in the lake. So you can watch the way Hindus bathe in lakes. You can watch the way they sip holy water, and you get an idea. Okay, guys. Thank you so much for joining.